Chapter 13. I get to do this again. I lost my first one, so I have to go back. All right, Chapter 13. It seemed like one more dream that my feverish brain had invented. The rising walls of another small fort, this one called Fort Boise, and smelling overpoweringly of fish. Still another river crossing, with swiftly running water lapping hungrily at the sides of our wagon bed boat. Leaking, weakly bawling cattle, men shouting at the poor struggling oxen, and when the crossing was finally over, I heard the hushed, sad voices of father and mother on the other side of the wagon cover. We would not see Mrs. Clark's cheery smile ever again. While we had been crossing the Snake, she had crossed over from life to death. They buried her on the bank of the river. Father dug a shallow grave, and Mother looked everywhere for flowers to place on that bare mound of earth. All she could find were some sunflowers, but they were pretty. She brought them to the wagon to show me. From my bed I saw Jesse Clark pass by, holding the hand of his 5-year-old brother. Willie, tears rolling down both their faces, and a little later I heard a little later I heard far off faint voices singing a farewell hymn. O Lamb of God, it ended. I come, I come. As soon as the wagons could be set up again and repacked, we had to move on. Little Willie kept crying for his mother, so Mother brought him to our wagon to try to comfort him. I was able to sit up now, but I was still too weak to get out of the wagon. Lavina had to do all of my chores. She played with Willie and did the dishes and carried water from the river. While filling the water bucket that afternoon, she found wild peppermint growing along the riverbank, and Mother used it to brew some tea for me. I thought it tasted a little good. Although I no longer had a fever, it seemed as if the bad dreams would not stop. Only I knew in my heart that I was not dreaming. Now it was Captain Clark who was sick with the fever. Though he struggled to keep leading the train, all the strength seemed suddenly to have drained out of his giant of a man. Finally he was forced to take to his bed. 2 days later, our wagon was in the lead when suddenly I heard a terrible scream coming from somewhere behind us. Whoa, Father shouted to the oxen. Turning to Mother, he asked, What was that? I think it came from the Clark wagon, Mother told him. You'd better go see what has happened. Father was gone for a long time. Later, he told us about the dreadful scene he'd encountered when he reached the Clark's wagon. Captain Clark was out of bed, staggering around with a butcher knife in his hand. Apparently, he had tried to stab his son Jesse with it. The poor man was so out of his mind with fever and grief. Father said that he did not know what he was doing. The younger children were screaming and sobbing, and little Willie had crawled under a flour sack, trying to hide himself from his father. This reminds me of the K, when Timothy got the malaria. Remember, he had to go run into the ocean to get cooled off. He had kind of a cray-cray moment there. Father talked to Captain Clark until finally he calmed down and handed over the knife. Then he sent Jesse to drive our team and the trembling Willie to be soothed by Mother. He put Captain Clark to bed and drove his wagon for the rest of the day. For several days after that, Captain Clark raved like a crazy man, and then he slipped into unconsciousness. Finally, he too died. And on the very day of his death, his son Jesse was taken sick with the same fever. Mrs. McReynolds took care of him and the other 3 Clark children and drove her own wagon, patient and uncomplaining. With her broad face and her blank, expressionless eyes, she reminded me of the oxen, plodding along steadily without seeming to know any more where she was going or why. I looked at her and at little Willie, an orphan now, so silent and shrunk into himself that he seemed to grow smaller every day. And I wondered why. Why had the Clarks left their safe home back in Ohio to make this journey that had ended so tragically for them? And what about all those other families who had buried a child or mother or father beside the Platte River? I had heard 100 times, it seemed, all the reasons for setting out for Oregon: the free land, the wonderful climate, the riches to be found, but suddenly they no longer made sense. What good was any of that if the people died? And what about Father? He was a careful man, a sensible man, yet he also had put his family at risk. When Mother was about to have a baby too, feelings that had been simmering inside me for a long time since Daisy died, or maybe even longer, came bubbling up. All at once I was furious with Father. How could he do that to us? Then for the first time in several weeks, Grandma's face floated into my mind. I could see her firm chin, her clear blue eyes, the energy that seemed always about to burst from her small body. She had done what we were doing now, and she had flourished. Maybe, I thought, it was some sort of spirit that passed down from one generation to the next, an itch in the feet or in the brain, a feeling of dissatisfaction, of thinking always that things could be better, or maybe something even simpler, the need to look over the next mountain and see what was on the other side. Whatever it was, it seemed to run in our family. I wondered if, like Grandma and Father, I would ever have it too. Now there was no one but Father to lead our little wagon train. We left the Snake River and for the time followed Burnt River, a small stream that wandered through a deep cut canyons. After miles of nothing but sagebrush, we began to see scattered junipers, and beyond them, in distant trees. They were the first forest we had seen since we left Missouri. It was well into September by now. The nights were beginning to grow cold, and we approached the Blue Mountains. I could see my breath in the frosty air as I got dressed in the early mornings. We put on extra coats and built our campfires bigger. Still, Cynthia's hands and feet were sometimes so cold that she cried. The Blue Mountains were even steeper and rockier than the Rockies. Up and up we climbed for 3 long days. Up sharp pitched rises and along narrow ridges, over rock-filled streams and in and out of hollows. The oxen were so worn out that they had to be goaded to start. But once they started, they strained and kept pulling, and then down slopes so steep that the wagon brakes had to be set on the last notch, and the wheels locked with chains besides. Sometimes it seems as if the heavy wagons would run over our poor patient beasts. All around us now were trees. Most of them were evergreens, tall and straight and spicy smelling. They rose into the air like dark columns, standing so close together that their branches intertwined. At last we could gather enough wood for our campfires, and we needed it. Cold winds whistled in the treetops. We had rain, and one morning, a little snow. One afternoon, we had stopped to make camp. Mother mixed up a pan of bread dough. She set it out on fallen log to rise, then went on with her work. From my perch up in the wagon seat, I saw Buck, one of our lead oxen, come wandering back into camp. "Mother," I cried, "the bread!" Mother hurried toward the log, John right behind her. "Shoo, Buck!" he cried, but it was too late. Buck's big black nose was in the pan. The bread dough dangled out of his mouth in sticky white strings. "Buck, come back!" John chased after him, shouting and waving his arms. Mother just stood there, as straight and still as one of the trees, not saying a word. Her eyes glistened with tears. I knew how little flour we had left to carry us through. A few minutes later, John came back. "I'm sorry," he said. "I couldn't get it out of his mouth." Mother looked at him blankly. Then, unexpectedly, the corners of her mouth twitched. "If you had gotten it out of his mouth," she said, smiling, "what would you have done with it?" John looked at Mother a little sheepishly, and we all started to laugh. I don't think I'd want bread that came out of the ox's mouth. Good old Buck, I thought. We were sure to suffer from the loss of that precious flour, but he deserved a treat. Coming down the long, jolting slope from the Blue Mountains, we found ourselves in prairie land once again, with willows and cottonwood trees, and another river to follow, the Umatilla. We made camp close by it. Here we encountered more Indians, this time of the Cayuse tribe. They seemed peaceful and industrious, doing some farming and even a little gardening. I was finally strong enough to help out again. Walking to the river for water that evening, I stumbled upon an Indian garden. It was only a small plot with more bare stalks and yellowing vines than anything else, but there, growing out of the dark, rich soil, was a large cabbage. It had been so long since I had seen any vegetables growing. I stood still, gazing at that cabbage with a kind of wonder. It was so green, so leafy and fresh. My mouth watered longingly. In my mind, I could almost taste it. "Mary Ellen." I turned to find Father watching me. "You know you mustn't touch it," he said quietly, his steady gray eyes holding mine. Of course I knew he was right. It was just that I was so hungry for green things. Only the night before I had been gnawing on a twig torn from a tree. "No, sir," I said. I couldn't let myself look again. Turning my back on that cabbage, I walked quickly away. Father tried to buy vegetables from the Indians, but they shook their heads at him. They had only enough for themselves. Instead, they offered to sell him chokeberries. But we had never tried them, and Mother was worried that they might be poisonous. So we had to go on, my awful cravings for vegetables and fruits still unsatisfied. When I awoke the next morning, I heard a strange little cry. It sounded like a bird, I thought groggily, or some other small creature. Opening my eyes, I saw Father looking down at me. On his face was a broad smile. I have a surprise for you, he said. Lavinia and Cynthia were already awake, chattering about what the surprise could be. Father pushed aside the blanket curtain, and the three of us stared. A new baby was in bed with Mother. She was smiling, too, though her face was as pale as a pillow cover, and dark circles of exhaustion ringed her eyes. Weakly she drew back the blanket so my sisters and I could see. The baby was so tiny and pink and helpless looking. It had red, squashed-in face and a worried look, like an old person. On top of its head was a funny dark wisp of hair. "It's a boy," said Father, his smile even wider. "We have decided to call him Elijah." "Elijah," repeated Cynthia softly. It was the name of one of our uncles, a name from the Bible, a big and joyful name, I thought. This baby was going to have to do a lot of growing to fit into it. His little hands waved jerkily in the air. His eyes looked everywhere as if wondering where he was and who we were. Something inside me melted like a chunk of butter. I am your big sister, I thought. I am going to take care of you. I reached out one finger to touch him. And amazingly, the baby closed his tiny fist around it. All that day we remained in camp so Mother could rest. Mrs. McReynolds came to our wagon several times to help care for her and the baby. Cynthia was fussy, saying that her mouth hurt, but I thought it was more likely she was just missing Mother. Lavinia and I tried to distract her with songs and games, and later John took her for a little ride on Polly. Meanwhile, Father did some of the washing and all of the cooking. He boiled up an old sage hen that John had shot, cooking it most of the day. The steam rising up out of the pot smelled so appetizing that I could hardly wait for supper. But when mealtime finally came, I was disappointed to find that the meat was tough. The soup was good, though. Father took some to Jesse Clark, who was so sick now that he could not eat it. Mother had a little with her tea and toast. The rest of us finished it and wished we had more. That evening after supper, Father read to us the story of Elijah from the Bible. The night was warm and clear. The last coals of the campfire glowed red in the dark. Overhead, the sky was filled with a million stars. They were our blanket, I thought, like Grandma's quilt spread over me, close and comforting. Father's voice was clear and strong, as if he might still be smiling in the dark. He read about the prophet Elijah, and how he was fed miraculously by ravens, how he cured a sick boy, how he overcame his enemies and brought rain to a land stricken by drought, all with the help of God. Oh, I couldn't help saying out loud, if only the ravens would fly down and feed us. Then from the wagon I heard again that tiny bird-like cry that I had first heard that morning, and I felt a flood of hope. So many bad things had happened to us along our way, storms and Indians, and terrible sickness and death. Still, it seemed as if someone was watching over us from up there among the stars. With the help of God, we were going to be all right. We had to be. We had Elijah now.